Kay went further into the street, slowly, as if he had plenty of time now, or as if the examining magistrate were looking at him from one of the windows and therefore knew that Kay had found his way there. It was shortly after 9. The building was quite far down the street, it covered so much area it was almost extraordinary, and the gateway in particular was tall and long. It was clearly intended for delivery wagons belonging to the various warehouses all round the yard, which were now locked up and carried the names of companies, some of which Kay knew from his work at the bank. In contrast with his usual habits, he remained standing a while at the entrance to the yard, taking in all these external details. Near him, there was a barefooted man sitting on a crate and reading a newspaper. There were 2 lads swinging on a handcart. In front of a pump stood a weak, young girl in a bed jacket who, as the water flowed into her can, looked at Kay. There was a piece of rope stretched between 2 windows in a corner of the yard, with some washing hanging on it to dry. A man stood below it calling out instructions to direct the work being done. Kay went over to the stairway to get to the room where the hearing was to take place, but then stood still again, as besides these steps he could see 3 other stairway entrances, and there also seemed to be a small passageway at the end of the yard leading into a second yard. It irritated him that he had not been given more precise directions to the room. It meant they were either being especially neglectful with him or especially indifferent, and he decided to make that clear to them very loudly and very unambiguously. In the end he decided to climb up the stairs, his thoughts playing on something that he remembered the policeman, Willem, saying to him, that the court is attracted by the guilt, from which it followed that the courtroom must be on the stairway that Kay selected by chance. As he went up he disturbed a large group of children playing on the stairs who looked at him as he stepped through their rows. "Next time I come here," he said to himself, "must either bring sweets with me, make them like me, or a stick to hit them with." Just before he reached the first landing, he even had to wait a little while until the ball had finished its movement. 2 small lads with sly faces like grown-up scoundrels held him by his trouser legs until it had. If he were to shake them off he would have to hurt them, and he was afraid of what noise they would make by shouting. On the first floor, his search began for real. He still felt unable to ask for the investigating committee, and so he invented a joiner called Lenz. That name occurred to him because the captain, Mrs. Grubach's nephew, was called Lenz, so that he could ask at every flat whether Lenz the joiner lived there and thus obtain a chance to look into the rooms. It turned out, though, that was mostly possible without further ado, as almost all the doors were left open and the children ran in and out. Most of them were small, one-windowed rooms where they also did the cooking. Many women held babies in one arm and worked at the stove with the other. Half-grown girls, who seemed to be dressed in just their pinafores, worked hardest running to and fro. In every room, the beds were still in use by people who were ill, or still asleep, or people stretched out on them in their clothes. Kay knocked at the flats where the doors were closed and asked whether Lenz the joiner lived there. It was usually a woman who opened the door, heard the enquiry and turned to somebody in the room who would raise himself from the bed. "The gentleman's asking if a joiner called Lenz lives here." "A joiner called Lenz?" he would ask from the bed. "That's right," Kay would say. although it was clear that the investigating committee was not to be found there, and so his task was at an end. There were many who thought it must be very important for Kay to find Lenz the joiner, and thought long about it, naming a joiner who was not called Lenz, or giving a name that had some vague similarity with Lenz, or they asked neighbors or accompanied Kay to a door a long way away where they thought someone of that sort might live in the back part of the building, or where someone would be who could advise Kay better than they could themselves. Kay eventually had to give up asking if he did not want to be led all round from floor to floor in this way. He regretted his initial plan, which had at first seemed so practical to him. As he reached the 5th floor, he decided to give up the search, took his leave of a friendly, young worker who wanted to lead him on still further, and went down the stairs. But then the thought of how much time he was wasting made him cross. He went back again and knocked at the first door on the 5th floor. The first thing he saw in the small room was a large clock on the wall which already showed 10 o'clock. "Is there a joiner called Lenz who lives here?" he asked. "Pardon?" said a young woman with black, shining eyes who was, at that moment, washing children's underclothes in a bucket. She pointed her wet hand towards the open door of the adjoining room. Kay thought he had stepped into a meeting. A medium-sized, two-windowed room was filled with the most diverse crowd of people. Nobody paid any attention to the person who had just entered. Close under its ceiling, it was surrounded by a gallery which was also fully occupied, and where the people could only stand bent down with their heads and their backs touching the ceiling. Kay, who found the air too stuffy, stepped out again and said to the young woman, who had probably misunderstood what he had said, "I asked for a joiner, someone by the name of Lenz." "Yes," said the woman. "Please go on in." Kay would probably not have followed her if the woman had not gone up to him, taken hold of the door handle and said, "I'll have to close the door after you. No one else will be allowed in." "Very sensible," said Kay, "but it's too full already." But then he went back in anyway. He passed through between two men who were talking beside the door. One of them held both hands far out in front of himself, making the movements of counting out money. The other looked him closely in the eyes, and someone took him by the hand. It was a small, red-faced youth. Come in," he said. Kay let himself be led by him, and it turned out that there was, surprisingly, a densely packed crowd of people moving to and fro, a narrow passage which may have been the division between two factions. This idea was reinforced by the fact that in the first few rows to the left and the right of him there was hardly any face looking in his direction. He saw nothing but the backs of people directing their speech and their movements only towards members of their own side. Most of them were dressed in black, in old, long, formal frock coats that hung down loosely around them.